Welcome to the Real Life Buyer podcast. In this podcast, you will hear interviews with business owners, entrepreneurs, thought leaders, authors, and technical specialists in their field. These professionals will hasten your development, accelerate your career, and broaden your business know-how. Now, introducing your host, Dave Barr, interviewing with a purchasing twist.
Hello, and welcome to the Real Life Buyer. I'm delighted to welcome my next guest, Brenden Kumarasamy. Brenden started his YouTube channel, Master Talk, to share public speaking tips he had learned through coaching many of his university friends for a business competition. This venture proved so successful that on the 25th of May in 2021, his YouTube channel hit 10,000 subscribers. And then by June 2022, his channel had surged to an incredible 24,000 subscribers. I've also subscribed to his channel as I recognize how incredibly informative and educational his videos are and how they may significantly improve my own public speaking ability. Brenden actually left his corporate job as a business transformation consultant at IBM to launch his own business, Master Talk, as a full-time public speaking coach in June 21, and now helps ambitious executives, coaches, etc., elevate their public speaking skills to be recognized as being in the top 1% of communicators in their industries. So without further ado, I welcome Brenden onto the podcast to discuss the skill, public speaking, and how you too may elevate your competence and confidence to deliver knockout presentations. Hello, Brenden.
Dave, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm really looking forward to this. We've had a few chats before our recording today. It's certainly a skill that I thoroughly appreciate, and so I'm full of questions for you. So I hope you're prepared.
Of course, let's do it.
So let's get to your story a little bit first. So would you mind sharing an overview of your journey that resulted in you becoming an extremely competent public speaking coach?
Absolutely happy to do that. So it all started when I was in college, Dave. To your point, I went to business school and I did these things called case competitions. Think of it like professional sports, but for nerds. So all the guys my age were playing rugby or footy or cricket. I wasn't one of those guys. I did presentations competitively. That's how I learned how to speak. But as I got older, I started coaching people who were in the programs because they needed help with their communication. And it was either me or a rock. So I guess they picked me. So I started helping them. And then that gave me the idea for Master Talk because I realized that no one in the world was posting free YouTube videos on communication and public speaking for the younger generation. So I started making videos on how to communicate ideas effectively. And over time, it just turned into something I never would have imagined.
So it's quite ironic that young people turn to yourself as being a fellow classmate. They recognize your skills kind of off the bat. So, I guess that's quite unusual, what I said.
Yeah, it definitely is.
Yeah. So for those listeners who perhaps have not had the opportunity or perhaps shy away from presenting or speaking, particularly in public, how would you suggest they start to learn basic presentation skills to overcome their fears and grasp key aspects of presenting well?
Absolutely, Dave. So before we jump into the tactics, I would say the most important piece is to dream. I'm sure a lot of people are listening thinking, what does he mean by dream? So let me explain. We dream about our businesses, our life goals, our relationship goals, our health goals. When was the last time we talked about our communication goals? When was the last time we dreamed about our communication skills in the same way we dream about our vacations? In the same way we dream about the expensive cars, expensive houses that we want to buy? When was the last time we did that for our communication? And the answer for most of us listening to this is never. So here's the question to start us off, Dave. How would your life change if you were an exceptional communicator? A lot of us equate communication to doing the dishes, kind of like a chore. Whereas for me, it's about leading a more fulfilling life because communication is every moment of our life, from the way we talk to our families to the way that we order food at a restaurant.
All right, that's an interesting concept. You're quite right. I've never dreamt about communication in that way. I've dreamt of the fears of communicating. One of my life histories is actually I come from a young child as being a stutterer. It was horrendous for me. For all my childhood, I stuttered a bit like a machine gun, a Gatling gun. And various circumstances meant I was able to break free of that. So it was those things I feared. Speaking in public, it was terrifying for me because of the humiliation and such. So it's kind of reverse psychology in my respect. So is there a time when you dreamt yourself about communicating in such a way that inspired you? Was there a person you could name and say, actually, I saw this individual and they blew me away and I thought, I want to be like them?
Oh, yeah. I love that, Dave. I would say for me, it was Scott Harrison, the CEO of Charity Water. It's a nonprofit. He started to help people gain access to clean water. And what I love about Scott's approach is he's someone who speaks to help other people. Because if he does well on a stage, he's going to raise millions of dollars to help the people who need it the most, people who don't even have access to clean water every day. And that was a big inspiration for me. And he has this great quote that I'd love to share. And the quote is, "The goal is not to live forever, but rather create something that will." So I just asked myself, am I creating something that's really helping other people thrive and get the results that they're looking for? So that was a big inspiration for me. The other big one was the case competitions I used to do as a kid. The reason they inspired me so much was because I saw myself on the other side winning those competitions. And I'm a very competitive guy. So I definitely pushed to the extent that I have to get to this level of mastery because I wanted to win that sport.
Right. Okay. That's something that's said by a number of different things, particularly athletes, where they project themselves at the moment when they, cross the finish line or achieve a certain goal. And that's the thing that helped them to get there, basically. And it's said, whether it's right, wrong, or indifferent, obviously I don't know, but it's said by imagining you actually doing it helps you perform at that level. Would you subscribe to that?
Absolutely. I'm a big fan of visualization, but more so in the context of driving happiness, not necessarily always results. So I'm not advocating that everyone needs to think like an Olympian athlete. You either got to get first place or you lose. I think it's more about when we visualize the outcome that we want. Let me give you an example. Think about, I call this relationship vision. What is the relationship you want with your kids? What is the relationship you want with your family? And right now you might be bickering, but do you want that relationship to be like that all the time? So if you start dreaming about that outcome, you're not really winning a race because, being a part of a family is an infinite game. It's not a finite game. Anyone can win the game. But when you think of it from that context, it becomes a lot more special. I'll give you one that might help us contextualize this, Dave. Somebody came up to me and said the answer to their question, how would their life change if they got good at communication, was showing their wife the world. And I didn't understand what he meant. So I asked him, I said, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, my wife doesn't speak English that well, Brenden. So if I learned how to communicate effectively and I got really good at it, I could show my wife the world. I could show her all these different countries and travel, and she wouldn't have to worry about speaking to the locals. I can do that for her. And I thought that was so beautiful because it's not really about winning a race. It's just creating that moment that you desire so much, and you use communication and it becomes a burning desire to get there.
That's a really good analogy there. Thanks for sharing that. So if I wind back a little bit and say, okay, I'm an individual. I have something coming up, which means I've got to speak in public. I don't know where to start. What is the place to start? Is it obviously following people like yourself, but how do people get into the comfort zone, should we say, of starting even to speak in an open way with people watching and listening?
Absolutely, Dave. So now that we covered the main question, let's get into what I call my easy threes. So these are the 3 easiest exercises. I have my entire library of content that even the most introverted person can start with and get the easy win and build the most important thing, which is momentum. When you see momentum, then you want to keep moving and getting the results that you want. So let's dive into that. Number 1, the random word exercise. All you have to do is pick a random word like tissue box, like wall, like eyes, like lights, and you give random presentations out of thin air. What I always tell people is if you can make sense out of nonsense, you can make sense out of anything. And that's the magic of the random word exercise. And what I also recommend, Dave, is don't do this alone. Do this with your kids. Do this with your nieces, your nephews, your family members, because you'll realize that people who are younger than you often do it better than you because they don't think about the judgment. They just do it. And that would be the first thing, is it helps us deal with uncertainty. And that's something easy that people can do on a daily basis. But there's 2 other ones as well.
Wow. That's really interesting. And that's triggered something with me because one of the moments where I managed to overcome my stutter was when I was an apprentice and I was forced into a situation by my trainer to do a presentation, my worst possible scenario. And it was something like, here you go, here's a pen, Dave, stand there for 2 minutes and tell everybody about a pen. Now, that sounds very simple. To me, it was terrifying, but that sounds very similar to what you've almost said. Find something very basic. You've chosen a word. I chose a product or an item to practice with in front of my peers. All these other teenagers that were in front of me, abusing me as well. That was the trigger that enabled me to snap out of my problem. So that's really good.
And I love what you shared there as well, Dave, because you mentioned some key words. While I was using the pen, people were abusing me, people were making fun of me. And the follow-up to that is that's why we don't get better. Like my version of the random word exercise is even if you're horrible, as long as you're doing it, I'm clapping. Right? Because if you're doing it, especially with your family, it becomes fun. And that's really the goal is if something's not fun and we always focus on the fear and the stress and the anxiety, then we don't really want to get better. Like in the same way, as an example, let's say I used you as an example. When you started your podcast, you probably had some fear. You're like, oh my God.
Absolutely.
Right. But now it's fun for you. You're super good at asking questions. You're very well prepped. And it also allows you to create change in the world. So your frame of reference, maybe in the past, and maybe it not have been, maybe there was some fear, but now there might still be a little bit left, but you see the bigger picture, which is, yeah, sure, random word exercise might be a little bit tough, but I get to interview Brenden or people who are just as amazing and get all these insights and share that with my audience. And I feel that's the frame of reference I wish everyone had.
Brilliant. Yeah, love it. Love it. Now, some of us have to present in our job, in our role. And obviously that is something that's foisted upon us quite often. And if you're a sales guy, obviously that's to a customer. If you're a buyer like me, that's to suppliers perhaps. And then if you're in a senior position or you're moving into a senior position, quite often it's your boss or your boss's boss. And on top of that, you may be, for whatever reason, from a social perspective, have to present to the public. Now, those are all presentations, but to 4 different types of scenarios. Would you say that the skills that you have to draw upon and the way you present to those 4 different types of public, should we say, should be different? Or do you think they are all the same?
Right. So I would say an easy way to answer this, Dave, is 80% of it should stay the same in terms of how you practice for it. We'll get into puzzle and how that works. But the other 20% is custom to the specific person you're speaking with. So I'll give an example with me. Let's say we take this podcast, makes things simple. 80% of the things I say in a podcast in any industry, I get on many odd shows because I'm a communication guy. So communication affects all industries. So sometimes I'm on a craft beer show, even if I've never really drank beer in my life. Sometimes I'm on a real estate podcast. Sometimes I'm on a buyer podcast. So it always changes. So 80% of the strategies, I'm still going to talk about the random word exercise, but the 20% gets customized to the specific industry I'm speaking to. And I constantly adapt it based on the challenges that you bring up to your own audience. So I feel that same 80-20 principle applies in the context of the 4 scenarios you mentioned, where 20% of it is having those conversations with that specific buyer or the specific seller and changing the languaging of your speech. But the 80% is how you practice, which is puzzle. So when we think about jigsaw puzzles, those toys we used to do as kids.
Yeah.
Right. So I'll ask you the question because you probably know the answer. It's easy. Don't worry. Is if you were to work on a puzzle, Dave, which pieces do you start with first and why?
If you're thinking about a jigsaw, then I'd start around the outside because you've got some straight edges and corners.
Exactly. Right. Straight edges and corners. And I would add, because you're absolutely right, they're also easier to find in the box. You just pluck them out, put them in.
Indeed, yeah.
But in communication, we do the opposite. We start the middle first. We shove a bunch of content, shove. We get to the presentation. We ramble throughout the whole thing, regardless of the scenarios you mentioned, because it's consistent across all 4. And then the last slide sounds something like this. Yeah, so thanks. Not the right approach. So instead, what I recommend is start with the edges, Dave. Practice the introduction. You're a great example. So you did this so well at the intro because you prepared it. That's why it came out so well. So practice the intro 50 times for your presentation. Then do the same thing with your conclusion. What's a great movie with a terrible ending? Last time I checked, terrible movie. Then tackle the middle.
Right. That's a really good tip. I like that. It said certainly what you want to start with is an impact, I guess, and you want to finish with an impact. So that makes absolute sense to me. Brilliant. Right. Love that thought.
And then the last piece of that as well, Dave, that I'll add, you're absolutely right. It creates impact, but it's also easier to do. So let's say we take the buyer example. who's most of your audience, let's say they got a 40-minute sales pitch. This is how it usually plays out in corporate. They practice it once for 40 minutes. They practice it twice. They practice it 3 times. So it's been 2 hours at this point. And now they're tired. It's noon. And you're like, shit, I need me some fish and chips. Like, I'm going to take a lunch. I don't want to do this. And then they don't practice and they forget until the last day. And they go, oh my God, I have a presentation. That's how most of it works. But let's play out that 2-hour scenario, because I know you like those granular details based on the quality of your questions. So let's play out that 2 hours. Okay, I'm a buyer. I'm focusing on this presentation. So the first 20 minutes, I just do the introduction, let's say 15 times. But after 20 minutes, I go, oh, my introduction is really good. This is solid. And then you go into your conclusion. Let's say you spend another 30 minutes and you practice your ending. So you've had 1 hour of practice, but your intro is perfect, like picture perfect. And your conclusion is picture perfect. So when you get to that point, you're like, oh, I never have to practice my intro and my close again. This is great. Now I have momentum. So the next hour, you're going to start creating your content. But notice how that the energy is different. Because in the first scenario, you just practice for 2 hours and you're like, oh my God, this is going to pain. Whereas the second time, you're like, I'm going to dominate this presentation. It's going to be easy. And that's the key.
Right. Brilliant. There's some good things to think about there. I'm going to have to ponder and process that. Now, the other challenge for you here is quite often, particularly when you're perhaps in your career as a younger individual, is that you have to present in teams. And so it's not you that got to wow the audience on your or by your own. It's also your team. And it's collectively you want to achieve a really good result. Now, obviously, the skill sets of the individuals in your team will vary. So if you found yourself in this situation, you've got, let's say, three other members going to be in your team, how do you go about kind of assessing and coaching the team so you can deliver that stellar performance?
You're absolutely right, Dave. You're only as strong as your weakest link in a group, unfortunately. So you need to make sure that you're well prepared. So a few things that I want to point out. There's 3 things. The first one is realize, Dave, that even when you're not speaking, you are a speaker. What does that mean? So let's say there's 2 people. Let's keep it simple, team of 2. Julia and Joe. So Julia's presenting and Joe's just looking in the sky and thinking, oh, I wonder what's for lunch. I wonder what's happening after. So what are you telling your audience? Joe's not talking, but he's saying something very important, which is the following. Well, if Joe spent 3 bloody months preparing this presentation with Julia and he ain't paying attention, I probably shouldn't either. This is probably not worth my time. That's what your audience is thinking. So even when you're not speaking, Dave, you got to talk. Not necessarily while the other person is speaking, but nodding your head, smiling, and paying attention. And it's so simple, yet makes all the difference. That's number 1. Number 2 is realize that leadership is required for success. In other words, what I'm saying is if you're listening to this podcast right now, you're doing something that most people aren't doing, which is you're investing time in yourself. You're asking yourself, how can I do better? How can I present better? Which means, in my opinion, I anoint you as the leader of the group, which means with the person who has the information, take action on it, understand the strengths and weaknesses of your team, give them the easy parts, make their life as easy as possible, coach them on their individual sections, be a leader so that all of your ships are solid. Last thing I would say, and this is counterintuitive. Not a lot of people talk about the third one, Dave. Have a solid Q&A system. Q&A, for those who are listening, questions and answers. What does that mean? If your Q&A section stinks, it calls into credibility your entire presentation. Let's say you're a buyer. You give a super amazing presentation with your group. It's all thought of. It's all super specific. You knock it out of the park. And then everyone's clapping saying, wow, this makes perfect sense. What about this question? And you guys are saying, and you start contradicting. Game over. Your whole presentation is called into question. How do you prevent that? 1, preparation, obviously. Prepare the questions that you think your audience is going to ask you. Prep the answers ahead of time. But there's a second thing. Have a very rigid system, strong system on how to deal with Q&A. I'll give you mine really quickly. It's called Q&A Master. I know I'm long-winded a little bit here, but I know this has helped people. So the Q&A Master is very simple, Dave. Let's say we're on the same team with, let's say, Julia and Joe, and I'm the master. Somebody asks us a question. All I do is I go to my left and I see you, I see Joe and Julia. Whoever has their hands in front of their bodies wants to answer the question, and whoever has their hands behind their bodies doesn't want to answer the question. So all I have to do as the master is I see your hands are in the front. So I go, Dave, go for it. Julia, go for it. And I distribute it. And if nobody shows their hands, I answer it.
That's a really good tip. I've never thought of that. Yes, a superb way of making sure that they're prepared or energized to answer give the response. So yeah, that's really neat. I like that. And it's such a subtle body language that most people won't even notice that, I would guess. So brilliant tip. Thank you for that.
You're absolutely right.
Now, we mentioned earlier on about introverts and extroverts. And quite often people think the best speakers are extroverts. So for those who do feel shy and consider themselves on an introverted scale, what advice would you give them? And are these beliefs actually misconceptions? Are introverts not so good at presentations?
Absolutely. The introvert myth. A lot of introverts seem to think that they're not great speakers, when in fact, all my best clients are introverts. So I always found that fascinating. So what's the advice, Dave? The advice is understand why you're better. What are the strengths that you have that you don't even realize? So let's talk about them. Number one, exceptional listening. I don't know if you're introvert, Dave, but you're doing an exceptional job listening to me, right? So that's the key, is that introverts, because they spend less time talking, they spend more time listening to their audience. So they're able to quickly adapt. I struggled so much with listening, Dave. I love to yap. That's why I'm a podcast guest. I'm always talking. And if you haven't guessed so far, those that are listening, I am an extrovert. So I struggled a lot when it came to listening. And I really had to pull myself back and change my energy whenever I coached people over the years. Introverts don't have that problem. It's just automatic. It's innate within them. Second, pausing. Pausing is the most powerful tool that you can use whenever you communicate an idea, because it draws emphasis to what you want people to hear. Introverts do this automatically. So let's say I coach an introvert and I say, hey, Dave, hey, Bill, somebody. By the way, when you pause, it'll make you sound more effective in presentations. They implement that tip almost instantaneously. Extroverts have trouble with pausing because we don't like to live in space. Let's say I'm at a party and I'm talking to you and there's a silence. I start panicking. I get fidgety and I go, so what's your favorite color? I always want to fill up the space. Introverts are very comfortable in silence because, once again, they speak less on average. So that's the second piece. Third piece, not a lot of people know. Introverts are actually more accessible to the general public than extroverts are. Let me give you an example of what I mean here. Gary Vaynerchuk. I love the guy. I have a ton of respect for him. That's why I like using him as an example. But let's face it, you either love the guy or you don't. There's no in between. Nobody who's seen Gary Vaynerchuk is going to say, I'm not sure how I feel about him. You either love him or you don't. But when it comes to Brene Brown, you are not allowed to say that I hate Brene Brown. Just saying that, the FBI can be after you. The cops will be after you at your house. You can't hate introverts. It's impossible. You almost have to try. And that's really the key, is that introverts are more accessible than extroverted speakers. And that's why I've changed my tone over the years. I used to be really loud like Gary, and I still am with private clients. But whenever I'm on a podcast, you'll notice that my energy shifts to the intention of the host. So that's the way that I've done this over the years. So I can relate to more people.
That's really good, because one of the people that I have huge respect for in public speaking, it goes back to Barack Obama, and the way he speaks, and he captures people. They're just mesmerized by the guy. Well, I certainly am as an individual. I was astounded when I watched that guy present, and I saw that as somebody I would aspire to be as good as if I could possibly be so. So I can see where you get the pauses from, for sure, because he seemed to be a master of just the right amount of pause for the effect without going over the top. That's what I found. And he drew on a good comparison between a sales guy, an extrovert, and a buyer, an introvert. Now, as buyers, we're kind of trained to listen more and purposely put in some silence. You question, why the silence? Because that encourages, because you mentioned yourself, an extrovert wants to fill the gap. And when the extrovert fills the gap, he tells you more information, he or she, shall I say, and therefore the buyer learns more. So that's just a little sideline that, for me, emphasizes what you've said, and it makes absolute sense. So brilliant. We're aligned. I like that.
Of course.
Great. Now, the next thing I've got is about projection and pronunciation. It's a difficult one in some respects. Some people do really struggle with projecting their voice, particularly when they're in a public speaking situation. They're nervous, I guess. I suspect they're all tight in themselves, and they struggle to get their voice heard at the back of the audience. as well. Are there anything that you could suggest are really good tips for improving those kind of concerns, how to deal with projection and pronunciation?
Absolutely, Dave. So there's a few things that I'll say. Let's start with beginner and we'll work our way up to more advanced things that I don't think people will do, but I'm happy to share on the podcast. So let's start with the simple 101. Have you booked 15 minutes in your calendar to do the random word exercise, to do the question drill, and to send video messages? Right? These are my easy threes, right? Doing the random word exercise, picking a random word, doing question drills, which is simply people ask you questions that you think the world will ask you. You reflect on an answer every day. And number 3, which is video messages. Make a list of people that you love. And when was the last time you sent them a 20-second note? Just saying, hey, Dave, thinking about you. Really appreciate it. Especially on the buyer side. If you're dealing with clients, sending video messages, always a good strategy because it means something to them. It helps you stand out from any other buyer in your industry. And I don't think I know any buyers who do that. So that's really the key. I would start the conversation there. Are we practicing consistently, especially the random word exercise? Doing that fixes a bigger issue than just knowing how to do it. It fixes the fear of judgment. Because eventually you just start having fun with it. You go, oh, well, lights, camera. Okay, let me just create presentations. And that removes the judgment that you might feel in a buying situation where you know exactly what you're talking about, you know exactly what products you're selling or receiving, etc. Last piece that I'll say, what is my specific advice on articulation and pronunciation? So you'll find this really bizarre, Dave, hence why I don't like to recommend this on podcasts. I know people won't do it, but I'll share it. Is one fun fact about me is I speak 3 languages fluently, English, French, and Tamil, but I can karaoke in 8 different languages. And the reason I say this is the best way to work on your pronunciation by far is to try and pronounce words that you don't understand. So I'll give you an example right now. When I switch languages, notice how quickly I switch. Let's say I go to Italian, buongiorno, come stai, molto bene, Eli. Let's say I go to Spanish, hola, como estás. Let's say I go to French, bonjour, comment allez-vous? And finally, Japanese, ohayo gozaimasu, genki desu ka? So I don't know how to speak many of those languages, but notice how my articulation switches so fast between languages. So when I go back to English, of course, my pronunciation is a joke. Like it's super easy to do that. So yeah.
Well, that's really interesting. I would never have thought of the foreign language angle on that. So yeah, that's kind of really interesting. Now, another one for you. There are a number of speaker organizations out there. Okay, I won't mention any names, but you can go to attend their weekly or fortnightly, or even monthly get-togethers, shall we say. And you've got the opportunity to be obviously with like-minded people and practice presenting to the other guys in the audience. Now, do you think it's a good idea to do that because of the practice? Or could there be an influence that if those people are novices like yourself and they give you feedback, would that feedback be useful or not? So I'm trying to figure out, I'm thinking about doing this myself. Is it going to be better for me to join, or could that actually reinforce bad habits?
It's a fantastic question, Dave. And I'm happy to name them, by the way, because I think it's a great organization. I'm an advocate. I love Toastmasters. I always recommend Toastmasters. And the reason is because it creates accountability for these tips. But now the question becomes, how does it work if you get advice from novice people? Here's what I would say. It all depends on what season you're in life. Okay, because I always like to give the honest answer. That's why we're here, right? And you won't see a lot of coaches say, because they might just say, oh yeah, you should just buy my stuff. That's not how I work. So for me, it's all about where are you in your career? So if you're getting started, you don't have a lot of money, you don't have a lot of budget, your career is just taking off right now, you just graduated from college, or you have a job that's not paying too much, I'm a huge advocate for Toastmasters. It's not expensive. It's like $100, $200 a year, max.
That's right.
There's clubs around the world, and it's built-in accountability. You can actually meet someone that you could practice. But what I would say for that season of life, be sure you're taking the conversation here, because this is not shared in Toastmasters, what we're talking about today, and apply the random word exercise. They don't teach that. The question drill, the video, apply that. So use our tips or other tips in the Toastmasters environment so that you can improve faster. That's what I would say. But, and there's a but here, eventually in your career, as you grow in it, you'll get to a point where your time is more valuable than your money. So that won't happen until you're maybe 3 to 5 years into your career or more. So when you get to that level, your time is precious. And that's where the challenge behind Toastmaster comes. And it's not a hit on them. I think it's a fantastic organization. It's just the way that the incentive model works as a nonprofit is naturally the best communicators won't stay in the group. So you won't get the best feedback. Does that mean you can still improve? Absolutely. It just takes more time, Dave. It might take even a few years to get better. But if you can afford to trade your time, by all means, go for it. Which brings us to the last part, which is somebody like me. At what point does it make sense to hire a coach or to join some program? It's really when you get to a point where the money that you're investing in a coach, which will run you a few $1,000s, is greatly outweighed by the benefit of learning how to speak exceptionally well in 3 weeks and 3 months max, rather than 3 years. Let me give you an easy example. Let's say you're a sales guy and your average commission is 1,000 or above, which is most of us. Okay, like you need to invest in your communication because you'll make more money than the 3. So that's how I would draw that nuance, but feel free to follow up.
Yeah, that's really, really good. And you've actually led into the next thing I was going to mention. And that was the fact that you have a free interactive workshop, I believe. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what that could do to help people?
Absolutely, Dave. Happy to. So every 3 weeks or so, I get on a Zoom call myself and I give a 90-minute workshop that's live, that's interactive, that's fun on the topic of effective communication. Everyone's welcome to it. So for those of you who want to register for that, all you have to do is go to rockstarcommunicator.com and you'll have access to that training.
Brilliant. Now, for people who are now really excited, you've got other platforms you feature on. Obviously, we've mentioned a few. Are there any others that you want to draw others' attention to? Where should they go to find out all about you?
Absolutely, Dave. It's such a pleasure being on by this great conversation. So the first one is definitely rockstarcommunicator.com. You can come watch me live. It's a fun experience for all of us. And the second one is, of course, the YouTube channel, Master Talk. Just go there and you'll have access to hundreds of free videos on how to speak.
Brilliant, brilliant. So I want to give you one final question now. Tease this out of you. The next challenge for many people, and there will be certainly in the UK, there's lots of different accents, and you only have to go 50 miles to get quite a transformation. Okay. If the difference between, let's say, the UK, London, for example, and Scotland can be a huge difference.
It's true.
Now, many people therefore have strong accents to deal with, and that can be difficult for the people on the receiving side interpreting what is being said. And obviously that can make people quite nervous, because if the person receiving the information is really clearly not understanding what you're saying, that's quite a negative. Of course, you don't know who's on the receiving side if you're public speaking. So what are your thoughts and recommendations on people with strong accents? Should they consider dumbing down their accent? Or what's your thoughts on that?
So every coach has their own opinion on this, Dave. So I'm happy to give you mine. My perspective is I've always believed, because most of my clients have thick accents, so I can definitely speak on this, is accent is a mindset. Accent is a mindset. And let me give you a ton of examples to prove this. The CEO of MasterCard, Ajay Bhandari, the CEO of Alphabet, Sundar Pichai, the CEO of IBM, Arvind Krishna. These are very successful people. They all got super thick Indian accents. Even Satya Nadella, to a certain extent, the CEO of Microsoft does too. But here, or actually, let me give a better one. Jack Ma, okay, the founder of Alibaba, multi-billionaire, thick accent when he speaks English. But here's the point I want to drive. Does anyone care? And the answer is no. Nobody cares because it's Jack Ma, right? So what's the conclusion? The conclusion is people only care about your accent if you choose to care about it. I've always believed that speakers are mirrors, Dave. Speakers are mirrors. We reflect our own emotions to the people we speak to, including our insecurities. So always ask yourself, what are you projecting to your audience? Imagine I came on every podcast and I would say something like this. I don't have a lot of experience. I'm 26 and I've only been in the business for 3 years and I don't know. I completely killed my credibility because people weren't even thinking about that. They were just listening to all the tips. Like, wow, this Brenden guy must be like 35 years old. He's been in this industry 15 years. Questions. I've never heard of any of this stuff. But if I draw emphasis to things that make me nervous, the audience is just going to start thinking about those ideas. And obviously, I don't have that imposter syndrome anymore. But I think what I want to drive with people is, what are you telling your audience to focus on? And the other piece is, instead of getting rid of the accent, ask yourself, Are you doing the random word exercise 100 times? Are you doing the question drills 100 times? Have you sent video messages to dozens and dozens of people? And when you start doing that and realizing that nobody cares about your accent, as long as you're excited, you're energetic, you're passionate, then you'll stop caring too.
Brilliant. Well, you can see our time's at an end. And for me, you've knocked it out the park. So fantastic responses to my questions. I really appreciate your own drive and energy, and what you've learned and shared today, I think is absolutely outstanding. So thank you for that, Brenden.
Of course, the pleasure is absolutely mine, Dave. And it's easy when the interview is so exceptional. So thanks so much.
I wish I was, but I'll take the compliment. I'm always happy with the compliment. No, that's brilliant. And you've got a lot of stuff to get on with now. So thanks very much for your time, as I said. And maybe we can talk again someday.
Of course, Dave. Always happy to.
Take care.
You too,
Bye.
buddy.
So there's another Real Life Buyer podcast. I do hope you enjoyed it and it's given you some ideas and inspiration for greater action and achievement. If you are a purchasing or a supply chain professional, business owner or director, come and join my Facebook group, the Purchasing and Supply Chain Community Hub, a safe place to engage with like-minded, friendly people. See you soon. Bye.